Kicking off our countdown at number 5, it's Bound for Glory 2020, a show that, while not a total disaster, just couldn't overcome the circumstances of its time. With the COVID-19 pandemic in full swing, the event took place in front of an empty arena. No fans, no energy, just pure silence. And that vibe lingered throughout the entire show, making TNA's biggest night of the year a bit bizarre. It all started with a unique moment in X Division history, with Jordynne Grace fighting for the X Division title in the opener. This once again proved why the no limits concept of the X Division can be so special. On paper the match was strong, but without the roar of the crowd, it lacked that impact, pun intended, that a scramble match usually delivers. Still, Grace's performance made a statement. Then came the Collier Shot Gauntlet Battle Royal, which had its fair share of highlights, but was overshadowed by a major injury. Heath, who had been looking to start a career resurgence after his WWE release, suffered a hernia mid-match, forcing the company to call an audible. What could have been a great moment for Heath was unfortunately cut short, leaving the gauntlet without its intended finish. The return of James Storm provided a nostalgia pop, and Daivari, looking more jacked than ever, brought a surprise appearance that turned heads, though it was a far cry from his old Sheikh Abdul Bashir character. The gauntlet was fun, but the injury and lack of live energy kept it from being a standout. Now, one of the most talked about matches on the card was Moose versus EC3 in a cinematic match. EC3 had reinvented himself with a new control your narrative persona, which definitely caught people's attention at the time. The match itself was creatively done, it had a storyline, the atmosphere was dark and gritty, and the storytelling was surprisingly compelling. Moose embracing his inner self and becoming more aggressive was a highlight, but looking back, this match hasn't aged well. It feels like a relic of the pandemic era, and what was once an exciting cinematic experiment now comes off as awkward and heavy-handed. Still, for a pandemic show, you had to give them credit for thinking outside the box. Then there was Eddie Edwards versus Ken Shamrock, one of the low points of the night. Shamrock, a legend in MMA and pro wrestling, was clearly not in his prime anymore, and this match really highlighted that. Eddie Edwards, known for his fast-paced, hard-hitting style, was forced to slow things down a bit just to accommodate Shamrock, and it resulted in one of the most slow, lackluster matches in Eddie's career. There was just no chemistry there, and it felt like two completely different styles clashing in all the wrong ways. Things didn't improve much with Chris Sabin defending the tag team titles by himself. With Alex Shelley absent, Sabin was forced into an underdog role, and while he's great at playing the scrappy babyface, the absence of a tag partner definitely hurt the dynamic of the match. Sabin put up a good fight, but it just didn't feel like a true Bound for Glory level tag title defense. One of the brighter spots of the night was the Knockouts Championship match. Deonna Purrazzo was set to defend her title against Kylie Ray, but Ray's last-minute absence led to the shocking return of Su Yung. The match was surprisingly intense, with Su Yung bringing a fight to Deonna. While some might argue that Ray's absence threw things off, Su Young's return was a moment that added some unpredictability to the night. Pretty underrated match here between Su and Deonna. And finally, the main event saw Rich Swann complete his redemption arc by defeating Eric Young for the Impact World title. Swann's story of overcoming adversity had built a lot of momentum going into this match, and his victory was a feel-good moment, a bright spot on an otherwise strange night. The match itself was solid, and seeing Swann hold up the title at the end brought some much-needed emotion to the event. All in all, Bound for Glory 2020 wasn't the worst show in TNA history, but the pandemic's limitations and the awkwardness of some of the matches made it a tough one to sit through, especially watching back. In another year, this might have been a decent event, but the empty arena vibe and lack of energy lands it at number 5 on our list. At number 4, we have Bound for Glory 2015, a show that might as well have been thrown together on the fly. If 2020 struggled because of the pandemic, 2015 had no such excuse. It was just poorly planned. Most of the matches had a 2-week build, and several of them were set up on the go-home show. You can feel how rushed everything was, from the thrown together matches to the lack of storytelling. The show opened with an Ultimate X match, a staple of Bound for Glory. Tigre Uno retained his X Division Championship in what was an early standout match. Afterwards, Shane Helms, yes, the Hurricane, came out after the match to stare down Tigre Uno. What did it mean? No one knew, because the match never happened. Next up was the infamous Bound for Gold Gauntlet match. And let me tell you, this was something else. We had a debuting Aiden O'Shea, better known as Jay Bradley, portraying an Irish thug. The match also featured Al Snow, Tommy Dreamer, and Mahabali Shera, who during the match stopped everything to perform his shuffle dance, which apparently had the power to send the entire ring into a trance. It was as strange as it sounds and easily the most cringeworthy moment of the night, which is saying something. Finalists ended up being Tyrus and Mr. Anderson, and somehow the biggest pop of the match came from the Pope D'Angelo De Niro, who briefly left the commentary desk to enter the match. Bound for Gold was supposed to be TNA's answer to the Royal Rumble, but this felt more like one of their terribly written comedy skits. Shera's dance moves combined with the flat atmosphere for a championship opportunity left a lot of people groaning. The Tag Team Championship match was next, and if you didn't know it, let me remind you, Kurt Hawkins and Cameron Grimes, yes, Trevor Lee, and Brian Myers did hold the tag team titles at one point. The Wolves would grab them back in a game of hot potato with the belts during the TNA vs. Global Force Wrestling feud, a rivalry that was supposed to lead to a co-branded Bound for Glory event. Obviously, we didn't get that, but what we did get was this solid match. The Wolves retained in what turned out to be one of the few bright spots on the card. Despite the lack of build, Richards and Edwards could put on a good match with just about any team. And then came Bobby Roode versus Lashley, which, despite their undeniable chemistry, felt completely out of place. Why is that? Because this match was set up on the Go Home show with the idea of, hey, they had great matches a year ago, why not do it again? With zero storyline going into the biggest event of the year, the heat just wasn't there. The two put on a solid match, but without a compelling reason to care, it couldn't reach the heights of their previous encounters. A great match on paper, but in execution, it fell flat in front of a dead crowd. The Knockouts Championship featured Gail Kim taking on Awesome Kong, and here we go again. The feud was reignited on the Go Home show with the same reasoning as Roode and Lashley. They've had great matches before, so let's do it again. There wasn't much story here, but seeing Gail and Kong square off is always a treat. The match itself was decent, but definitely not at the level of their earlier classics. Even Gail Kim's husband, celebrity chef Robert Irvine, got involved for some fun, but this wasn't the legacy match it could have been. Then we got to Kurt Angle versus Eric Young, one of the few matches that actually had a long-term story behind it. This was Kurt's big return after being sidelined with an injury, but the match just did not live up to expectations. Most of it saw Eric Young working on Kurt before Kurt inevitably played his greatest hits in the closing moments. The booking kept it from being memorable, and if you had seen any of their previous encounters earlier in the year, you knew this one did not measure up. Finally, the main event, EC3 versus Drew Galloway versus Matt Hardy. Galloway was supposed to be the hot new babyface, but his momentum had cooled significantly. He had led a terrible stable called The Rising and was at the center of the lackluster TNA vs. Global Force war. Realizing that nobody was hyped for EC3 versus Galloway, TNA threw Matt Hardy into the mix just days before the event. Hardy ended up winning the TNA World Championship in his hometown, with Jeff Hardy serving as the special referee and helping his brother pick up the win. It was a feel-good moment, until Matt decided to vacate the title days later from his couch, setting up the infamous World Title Series. Easily one of the most convoluted booking decisions in TNA history. In the end, Bound for Glory 2015 had some solid in-ring action, but the lack of planning and virtually non-existent build made it feel more like a B-show than the company's biggest event of the year. Some of the matches were enjoyable, but when most of your card is set up last minute, it's hard to make anyone care. And that's why Bound for Glory 2015 lands at number 4 on our list. At number 3, we have Bound for Glory 2013, a show that signaled the beginning of TNA's decline. The company was struggling to maintain momentum, and this event, despite its star power, felt like it was running on fumes. For TNA's WrestleMania, this just came off as flat, rushed, and poorly executed. The fan interest just wasn't there anymore also, and it showed from the very start of the night. The show opened with what you would assume was an amazing Ultimate X match. Manic defended against Austin Aries, Chris Sabin, Samoa Joe, and Jeff Hardy. On paper, this is a dream match, with some of the top stars in the X Division's history colliding for the title. But unfortunately, what could have been a standout match ended up feeling rushed and strangely flat. The excitement that normally surrounds an Ultimate X match just wasn't there, and it didn't help that the build-up for this match was nearly non-existent. It didn't make sense to me for TNA to put so many of their top stars in such a meaningless Ultimate X match. As talented as these guys are, they just couldn't overcome the lack of story and energy from the crowd. Sabin ended up walking away with the belt, but this wasn't the moment it should have been. Next up, we had James Storm and Gunner defending their tag titles against the Bromans, a team that doesn't get enough credit for how good they were during this era. Robbie E and Jesse Goddard were the perfect obnoxious heel team, and to make things even more bizarre, they were accompanied by Phil Heath, a pro bodybuilder. Why was he there? Who knows? It's one of those random TNA moments that doesn't make much sense, but adds to the weird charm of the show. The match itself was surprisingly good though. The Bromans put on a solid performance, and James Storm, as usual, shined in the tag team setting. If nothing else, this match helped establish the Bromans as legitimate threats in the division. But again, the lack of build leading into this match hurt its overall impact. The Knockouts Championship was defended next, with ODB facing Gail Kim and Brooke in a random triple threat. This match felt thrown together at the last minute and didn't really have any real stakes behind it. Gail Kim ended up winning the match thanks to help from Lady Tapa, who made her debut as Gail's new muscle. Now, Lady Tapa, for those who don't know, is the niece of wrestling legend Barbarian, so there was some excitement around her debut. Unfortunately, she didn't live up to the hype, and her run as Gail's enforcer turned out to be pretty forgettable. The match itself was decent, but far from memorable. Then came a match that saved the night from being a total disaster: Kurt Angle versus Bobby Roode. These two have always had great chemistry, and they went all out for this one, going a full 21 minutes and delivering the type of match you'd expect from two legends. The closing moments were especially strong, with Roode picking up the win after Angle passed out from a submission. Despite the great in-ring action, the questionable booking looms over this match. It left a lot of fans scratching their heads, but it was still a standout match on an otherwise lackluster card. After that, we got the debut of EC3, Ethan Carter III, one of TNA's most hyped debuts in years. But instead of a major moment, EC3 was put in a squash match against Norv Furnham, who you might know better today as Peter Avalon. EC3 had all the makings of a main event star, but throwing him into a squash match on your biggest show of the year, that wasn't the best way to introduce him. The match itself wasn't bad for what it was, I guess, but on a Bound for Glory stage, it felt completely out of place and wasted a major debut. EC3 would go on to be a major player in TNA, but this wasn't the debut he deserved. Then we got Magnus versus Sting, a match that should have been a passing of the torch moment for Magnus. Sting, a wrestling icon, was nearing the end of his TNA run, and the goal here was to solidify Magnus as a top star. And while the match itself wasn't horrendously bad, it was marred by a shockingly dead crowd. The energy just was not there, and it made the match feel so unimportant. Even more, Magnus made Sting tap out, which was a huge deal considering Sting rarely lost in TNA, let alone submitted. But the lack of fan reaction made the entire moment feel flat, and instead of being a career-defining victory for Magnus, it was just another match. Finally, we get to the main event, which saw AJ Styles take on Bully Ray for the TNA World Championship. This was AJ's Summer of Punk moment as he fought against Aces and Eights with Dixie Carter watching from ringside. On paper, this was an epic match, and to be fair, the in-ring action was excellent. AJ Styles, as always, put the company on his back, and the match had some truly memorable moments, like AJ's 450 splash through a table, and his final spiral tap to win the TNA World Championship for the last time. But the context of the show dragged this one down. It was clear that TNA's best days were behind him, and even though AJ's victory was meaningful, it couldn't salvage a show that just lacked buzz and excitement from the start. AJ's win was the last truly great moment of his TNA career, but it was overshadowed by the overall underwhelming nature of Bound for Glory 2013. In the end, Bound for Glory 2013 was a mixed bag. Great talent and some strong in-ring action, but it couldn't overcome the lack of fan interest and the rough, disjointed nature of the show. With a poor build-up and a dying fan base, BFG 2013 lands at number 3 on our list. Down to number 2, we have Bound for Glory 2014, 1 year later. A show that promised to be something special, but ended up being one of the strangest and most forgettable entries in the history of TNA's flagship event. This year marked the first ever international Bound for Glory, held at the legendary Korakuen Hall in Tokyo, Japan. That alone had fans buzzing with excitement, but when the card was revealed, it became clear that something was not right. Instead of seeing the culmination of TNA's biggest storylines, fans were treated to a series of TNA vs. Wrestle 1 matches, none of which had any real build or stakes. If you were hoping for an event like Forbidden Door, where top stars from different promotions clash, this was not exactly that. Instead, we got matches like MVP vs. Sakamoto. Yes, Tenzai's old friend. The lack of storytelling coupled with the unfamiliar matchups left this event feeling like a throwaway show that just happened to take place on the biggest night of TNA's year. The show kicked off with Minoru Tanaka taking on Manic. Tanaka was a legend in Japan, and making his return to TNA after competing in the World X Cup back in 2006. This match was great. It had that fast-paced, innovative style that TNA's X Division was known for. The 13-year-old fan in me saw this as an introduction to a new style of wrestling, almost like the first time you turned on WCW Nitro and saw cruiserweights in action. But while it was fun, it didn't have the significance or hype that a Bound for Glory opener should have. A great match, but in the context of the show, it was a bit out of place. Then came EC3 versus Ryota Hama. This was a pure comedy match. Ryota Hama, for those unfamiliar, is a sumo wrestler who is, let's say, not exactly known for his technical prowess. It was entertaining in its own weird way, with EC3 playing the cowardly heel, trying to figure out how to deal with this massive guy. But again, for Bound for Glory, this was not the type of match you expect to see on the biggest night of the year. It was fun for what it was, but it didn't belong on this stage. Next up was MVP vs. Sakamoto, a match that could be best described as the most basic heel versus babyface match you will ever see. MVP, of course, had spent time in New Japan Pro Wrestling before joining TNA, so the Japanese fans gave him a warm homecoming. But the match itself, let's just say it didn't live up to that reception. Sakamoto had most recently been known as Tenzai's partner in WWE, and while he's a decent wrestler, there was just no story, no heat, and no real reason to care about this match. It was what it was, filler. One of the few real highlights of the night was the X Division Championship match, with Samoa Joe defending his title against Low Ki and Kaz Hayashi. Kaz Hayashi had competed for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship back in the day, so you've got guys with a lot of experience. This match was short, just over 10 minutes, but it was a reminder of how great the X Division could be. Fast-paced, hard-hitting, and full of great moments. It gave the fans something to cheer for. Still, with no build behind it and no real stakes, it felt like it could have taken place on any other random TNA show. After that, we got a Wrestle 1 showcase match, which was even stranger when you consider this was supposed to be TNA's biggest night of the year. Can you imagine WWE having a TNA showcase at WrestleMania? No. It was essentially a battle between Tajiri's proteges and Kaz Hayashi's proteges. The match itself was fun, and we got a glimpse of future star Ikemenjiro, who would go on to make a name for himself later in his career. But again, this was supposed to be Bound for Glory, not a random Wrestle 1 show. For those watching at home, it felt pointless and out of place. If you weren't already familiar with the Wrestle 1 talent, there wasn't a lot of reason to care. Although I was entertained by the young, hungry individuals that offered a fresh style to me as a kid. Then came the obligatory Team 3D Hardcore Brawl. Bully Ray and Devon faced Abyss and Tommy Dreamer in a match that pretty much wrote itself. If you've ever seen a Dudley Boyz tag match, you can imagine exactly what this looked like. Tables, chairs, the usual spots. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't anything new or exciting either. It felt like a recycled hardcore match that we had seen dozens of times that year, and it really didn't add anything to this show. Next, the Knockouts Championship was defended in Japan, something that had only happened a couple times before. But instead of delivering a standout match for the women, we got Havoc versus Velvet Sky, and to say this match was bad is putting it lightly. It was easily one of the worst Knockouts matches in Bound for Glory history. The lack of chemistry, sloppy execution, and the fact that it seemed thrown together last minute all contributed to this being a low point of the night. And that is saying something. It's a shame because Bound for Glory was a chance for the Knockouts division to really shine on a global stage, and this is what they offered. Finally, we got to the main event. James Storm and Sonata taking on the Great Muta and Tajiri. This was the only match on the card that had any story behind it. Storm had recruited Sonata, brainwashing him to turn on his mentor, the Great Muta, thus becoming the Great Sonata. The story was solid, if not a little goofy, and the match was fun, especially with Muta and Tajiri hitting their double miss spot, something I'll never get tired of seeing. But the problem is, while this was a cool match, it didn't feel like a Bound for Glory main event. Heck, it could have been on Bound for Glory, it just would have been suited better as a mid-card match. The stakes just weren't there, and it didn't have that big match feel that a Bound for Glory main event should have. Now here's the thing, while Bound for Glory 2014 had the worst storytelling, worst build, and little to no meaningful matches, the atmosphere was actually pretty great. The Korakuen Hall crowd brought some life into the show, and there were some genuinely good matches. But the problem was the overall execution. The card was disjointed, and it felt more like a Wrestle 1 event than TNA's biggest night of the year. There's no denying that TNA missed the mark here. They had a golden opportunity to create something special by taking Bound for Glory international, but instead it felt like a glorified house show. And that's why Bound for Glory 2014 lands at number 2 on our list. And taking the number 1 spot on our list is the chaotic, disastrous, and baffling Bound for Glory 2017. This show had everything working against it. A botched rebranding, a lackluster build, confusing booking decisions, and to top it all off, one of the worst main event finishes in pro wrestling history. Originally promoted as Global Force Wrestling Bound for Glory, this event was supposed to be a fresh start for TNA under the GFW banner. But after Jeff Jarrett's sudden departure and Anthem deciding not to finalize the GFW acquisition, the company quickly rebranded the event as Impact Bound for Glory, just weeks before the show. With this kind of backstage turmoil, it's no surprise that Bound for Glory 2017 was a train wreck from start to finish. The show opened with Trevor Lee defending his X Division Championship in a 6-way, featuring stars like Wes Lee, Sanjay Dutt, Angel Garza, Petey Williams, and Matt Sydal. Now looking at the talent involved, this should have been a high-energy X Division classic, right? Wrong. Despite the star power, the match was surprisingly flat. Maybe it was the smaller crowd at the Aberdeen Pavilion, but this match just didn't deliver the way an X Division match should. Trevor Lee retained, but it set the tone for a night that would only go downhill. Then we got one of the most bizarre booking decisions of the night. Earlier that day, it was announced that Taya Valkyrie wouldn't be able to make the show, thus canceling her planned Red Wedding match with Rosemary. So how do you fill that time? With Taiji Ishimori and Tyson Dukes. Now, if you're wondering why these two were wrestling on Bound for Glory, you're not alone. This match had zero build, zero meaning, and felt like it was just thrown on the card last second, because it was. To make matters worse, the camera kept cutting to Chelsea Green, who was in the crowd, seemingly more interested in her than the match itself. Why did this happen? Who knows? But this was easily the most pointless match in Bound for Glory history. Now we get another curveball. Alberto El Patron, who had been suspended from the company earlier in the year, made an unplanned appearance, storming the ring to cut a promo. Now, the announcers played this up like Alberto wasn't scheduled to come out, and his promo was one of the most bizarre segments of the night. He started ranting about how the company had wronged him, then started berating Jeremy Borash for no apparent reason. At one point, it seemed like Alberto was about to assault Borash, but he backed off, promising that tonight would be amazing. It wasn't. The show took a hard nosedive with a Monsters Ball match between Abyss and Grado. On paper, this had potential. Abyss a hardcore icon and Grado a comedic fan favorite, and they were having a decent feud going into the event. But the match, an absolute disaster. Abyss had just come back from a knee injury, and it was clear that he was not at 100%. The match was clunky, slow, and just full of awkward spots. The finish involved Rosemary showing up for a random interference, which only made things more confusing. To make matters worse, both Abyss and Grado were reportedly upset backstage about how badly the match fell apart. What should have been a fun hardcore match turned into a sloppy mess that left the fans and even the wrestlers disappointed. Things didn't get that much better with the Team Impact versus Team AAA match, which should have been a hot interpromotional bout. But instead, we got one of the most boring matches of the night. EC3 and James Storm, who were feuding literally just a couple months earlier, were now teaming for no reason other than brand loyalty. A brand that had gone through 3 different names in a month. They added Eddie Edwards to their team to take on El Hijo del Fantasma, Pagano, and Tejano Jr. The match had no heat, no drama, and no stakes. It was just a long, dull slog that the crowd couldn't care less about. This match was supposed to build on TNA's partnership with AAA, but instead, it ended up being one of the most forgettable moments of the night. Thankfully, we did get one standout match, OVE versus LAX. This was the one moment of the night where it felt like the show had real energy and intensity. OVE retained their tag titles in a hard-hitting brawl that brought the crowd to life for the first time all night. To make things even more exciting, Sami Callihan made his debut, helping OVE pick up the win. The crowd didn't seem that aware of who Callihan was at the time, but this moment kicked off the best run of his career. The double turn between LAX and OVE was well executed, and it's the one bright spot in a night full of bad booking and bizarre decisions. Next up was Six Sides of Steel pitting Lashley and King Mo against Moose and UFC legend Stephan Bonner. Now, this match was a bit of dumb fun, and honestly, it was better than it had any right to be. Both King Mo and Bonner are MMA fighters with limited wrestling experience, but they managed to make it work. Moose's insane dive off the cage was the highlight of the match, and it helped salvage what could have been a total disaster. It was a fun, chaotic bout, and it felt like the kind of spectacle that should be on a Bound for Glory. Not great, but enjoyable in the context of the show. And then, the main event. Eli Drake defending his Impact World Championship against Johnny Impact. This match had all the makings of a solid main event. Drake was someone people wanted as a champion, while Johnny Impact was the shiny new toy in the company. The match started off well enough, with both guys delivering some unique spots. And just as it was getting really good, Alberto Del Rio stormed the ring and ruined everything. In one of the worst booking decisions in TNA history, Del Rio attacked both men, including a vicious chair shot to Johnny Impact's head. He then dragged Eli Drake over Johnny for the pin, allowing Drake to retain in what can only be described as a mind-numbingly bad finish. The fans were stunned, and not in a good way. The fact that the entire main event was used to set up a feud with Alberto Del Rio, a guy who was suspended a few months ago, was a slap in the face to everyone who had invested in Eli Drake's title reign. Bound for Glory 2017 was already a mess before the main event, but that final moment solidified it as one of the worst shows in TNA history. The entire night felt chaotic, from the rebranding debacle to the pointless matches, and Alberto Del Rio's interference only made it worse. The booking was confusing, the atmosphere was dead, and by the time the show was over, most fans were left wondering what they had even just watched. That's why Bound for Glory 2017 easily takes the top spot as the worst Bound for Glory of all time. Are there any terrible Bound for Glories that I'm missing? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos.